Ugh. Definitely need something more refreshing. Ah, that's what I'm talking about. The TU150 by Lian Li. So this is the type of ITX enclosure that I personally love. It's not too bulky, yet it's not too compact either to like compromise on cooling compatibility. Assembly procedure is super straightforward. The price is right at $109, which is super competitive for an ITX direction. And I feel like Lian Li really killed it this year with the TU150. Let's check it out right after this.
The Sound Blaster A9 is a special kind of treat for audio enthusiasts with their best EMI shielding yet, a fantastic DAC and swappable op-amps, plus a well-designed breakout box that includes an XLR input. Your ears deserve the best, and perhaps your motherboard needs a friend. Check it out below.
Alright, so for the price point, the aluminum construction is pretty excellent. I love the silver edition because it hides all the finger marks, yet it still reveals the grain of the brushed aluminum. If you go with the black version, that is at your own risk because all the finger marks will be visible. We do have a glass side panel that is blacked out at the top to hide the power supply section and top the motherboard. An interesting fact, the panels are swappable if you wish to do so. I don't see why you would, but it's a possibility. Just keep in mind the glass panel is slightly thicker, so the aluminum panel is not flush against the frame. I do love the toolless approach with pegs in case you want to repaint the exterior chassis or mod it in some way. Plus, it just keeps the entire exterior super clean. The I/O consists of dual USB 3s, a Type-C Gen 2 port, power reset buttons, and your audio jacks. Unfortunately, the power and reset buttons do wobble, like they're not completely stable in their housing, and that is pretty much the only kind of a compromise I can point out in this entire enclosure. And for the price point, that's not a bad thing. In terms of other design elements, I do appreciate the angular pieces on the sides to slim down the entire front panel and that mesh here to help with airflow. And can we just talk about the brilliant handle up top? Not only does it hide in a low profile position when it's not extended, but it's also built into the frame, so there's no worry about like actually supporting the weight of your system. And for an ITX direction, I love this integration, especially because I can bring this to shows and you don't necessarily need to handle the case by its frame, because you have a handle. Now, size-wise, I feel like it fits the perfect middle ground between something that is not too tiny like the Den case or not too bulky for ITX like the H210 from NZXT. So I feel like Lian Li has done a pretty good job in keeping things as compact as possible without compromising on cooling. So the CPU tower clearance is fantastic. You have 165mm clearance for the CPU tower and 320mm for the GPU. So it's not super radiator friendly. You could install a 120 rad at the back, and that is the only position where water cooling is possible. We do have a dual 120mm fan slot at the bottom, but that is mainly to install like dual fans for intake to help with GPU cooling. And we do have a single 120mm mount at the front, but that is mainly to be used for intake, which is dust covered, by the way. And radiator clearance here is not possible because the power supply is right above the fan and there is no possible way to install a radiator there. So I really appreciate that Lian Li has kind of focused their attention on making sure there's enough height clearance for a good CPU tower instead of trying to like cram in radiator clearance like a 240 rad on the side like we've seen with the N case, for example, and I really appreciate that. The only negative thing here is that we don't have any dust filtration at the bottom, which is most likely to be used for intake for GPU cooling, so just keep that in mind. I mounted my Noctua U12A in there, and that is a fantastic combo because it's quiet, it cools incredibly well. I don't even need to install anything for the back because of the dual fan configuration, so the exhaust is plenty. As for the internals, we have 3 PCI slots to support those beefy GPUs, our standard ITX motherboard area with plenty of space above and on the side. For storage, you can mount a 3.5 inch or an SSD above the motherboard area with appropriate cutouts, and 1 SSD on the side of the motherboard below your power supply. So the power supply compatibility here is for SFX or SFXL, which is great because they're not trying to cram an ATX power supply in here, and there is enough clearance for the top here, but it would totally like block off the front intake fan. And I really appreciate this whole prioritization, make sure that the cooling is sufficient while keeping the enclosure with its hardware pretty focused. As for cable management, this is by far the easiest cable management work for this size. Not only can you route cables behind the motherboard tray, like your standard configuration, but you can also route cables above the top plate or below the top panel. So for example, I routed my 8-pin CPU cable through there because there's enough cable length on it, and you can just basically hide things above or behind the motherboard for this super clean interior that for an ITX form factor, I mean, that is pretty impressive. The fact that they can only support SFX L or SFX power supplies means that this whole blackout section at the top hides the power supply, and as long as you're pretty smart with how you hide the cables on the interior, then the entire build will look absolutely seamless in terms of cables without anything sticking out. And for an air-cooled ITX enclosure, that is pretty impressive. And so this quickly became one of my favorite ITX enclosures. Even though it's not super compact, I love the entire user-friendly angle, mounting hardware, removing the side panels, doing all the cable management work, and having such good cooling compatibility. Some of you might say that there's plenty of space wasted below the power supply and beside the CPU cooler, and I would say that's just the nature of having, you know, plenty of space for the GPU in terms of length, and I don't mind the width of the chassis because we have such good CPU tower clearance, and that is exactly what I would do with an ITX enclosure. In this form factor, I don't mind that there's not plenty of radiator clearance inside. I love the focus on airflow, and that is what you get. It feels like this case was made for me, even though it's not super tiny. I love everything about it, except for no dust filter at the bottom and the slightly rattling power and reset switches. Alright guys, make sure to check out this other relevant content. Let me know what you think of the TU150 in the comments below. I'm Dmitry, and I'll talk to you in the next video.